Nicht anders als bei den Vollzeitlern. Ja, also, dann sage ich einmal herzlich willkommen an diesem heutigen Nachmittag. Ungeplant sitzen wir zu Hause, bewaffnet mit Kaffee, Heferl und Co., anstatt uns durch die Schneemassen wühlen zu müssen, was an und für sich, glaube ich, für alle Beteiligten in dem Fall das Beste ist. Und eine weise Entscheidung getroffen worden ist, das einmal online starten zu lassen. Was allerdings ungewöhnlich ist, denn normalerweise schaue ich gerne den Leuten ins Gesicht, die ich ein Semester lang betreuen darf. Aber ich bin ja auch im Online-Setting recht gut daheim. Somit würde ich mal sagen, ich stelle mich kurz vor. Mein Name ist Monika Richter. Ich bin schon jetzt mittlerweile über 10 Jahre an der FH Burgenland exklusiv für diese Lehrveranstaltung Internationale Volkswirtschaftslehre, bin aber auch auf anderen FHs sehr stark präsent und habe auch einen Lehrauftrag an der BOKU in meinem zweiten Steckenpferd, dem Nachhaltigkeitsmanagement, wo ich über die ISO 14001 und Umweltmanagementsysteme sowie Nachhaltigkeitsberichterstattung äh, berichten darf. Aber der Volkswirtschaftslehrer gehört mein Herz und das schon seit geraumer Zeit. Ja, ich möchte jetzt nicht in Jahrzehnten sprechen, aber es ist doch schon frisch gefangen vom fertigen Studium, stand ich schon im Hörsaal und habe auf der WU Studierende unterrichtet. Und das darf ich jetzt auch bei Ihnen machen. Das heißt, wir fangen mit der Organisation an, aus dem einfachen Grund, konkretisierte Erwartungen sind der Weg zum Erfolg. Und Sie werden gesehen haben, im Moodle habe ich einmal in homöopathischen Dosen ein paar Dinge hineingestellt. Auf Teams habe ich auch schon was hineingestellt und das gehen wir jetzt einfach gemeinsam durch, dass Sie auch wissen, was Sie erwartet. So, schauen wir gleich einmal. Genau. Was ich festgestellt habe, ist, dass hier in diesem Team auch die Vollzeitstudierenden drinnen sind. Ich weiß jetzt nicht, ob die auf unsere Materialien zugreifen können. Das wäre mir in dem Zusammenhang gar nicht so wirklich recht. Und das heißt, ich werde die Materialien, die wir hier im Online-Modus bearbeiten, nach der Lehrveranstaltung immer herunternehmen und ins Moodle verfrachten. Ja, dass wir da unsere Exklusivität wahren. Was ich gemacht habe, ist hier Teams-Kanäle einzurichten, wie Sie vielleicht hier auf der linken Seite sehen. Die werden wir brauchen, denn ein wichtiger Bestandteil der Lehrveranstaltungsorganisation ist, dass Sie in Projektteams dann kleinere Fragen ausarbeiten. Diese Ausarbeitungen schauen wir uns dann gemeinsam im Plenum an. Das heißt Kurzpräsentationen während der Lehrveranstaltung. Das gestaltet die Lehrveranstaltung an sich aktiver, auch für Sie, funktioniert auch im Online-Modus gut. Und damit das nicht umsonst ist, was Sie hier ausarbeiten, werden diese Ausarbeitung dann Bestandteil der Prüfungsunterlage. Ja, also Sie machen das nicht aus Jux und Tollerei, sondern können das dann tatsächlich weiter verwenden, wenn das ein bisschen überarbeitet ist. So, was sehen Sie hier? Erstens einmal unseren Lehrveranstaltungsüberblick, wo Sie genau das erkennen können, was ich Ihnen jetzt geschildert habe, unsere Termine und wo sie stattfinden, was ich mir unter Mitarbeit vorstelle. Das heißt, Gruppenarbeiten, wobei diese Gruppenarbeiten in fixen Arbeitsteams stattfinden. Sie sind im 6. Semester, Sie kennen sich schon gut, Sie wissen, wer mit wem kann und gut funktioniert. Da mische ich mich nicht ein, das ist Ihr Ding, wie Sie das organisieren. Und unsere Leistungsbeurteilung besteht ja aus einer Klausur, auf die ich Sie gut vorbereiten werde, insbesondere auch in der letzten Stunde vor der Prüfung. Da werde ich dann mit Ihnen eine spezielle Analyseform von Cases durchgehen und einer quasi Seminararbeit für Sie, äh, hier genannt Written Individual Work. Nichts allzu Ausführliches, 2 Seiten. Sie sollen ein Kapitel zusammenfassen aus der Literaturgrundlage und dieses Kapitel bearbeiten plus eine kleine Fallstudie dazu. Aber von denen, die wir durchmachen. Kleine Erziehungsmaßnahme für mich, ja, nicht für Sie. Wenn wir einen Termin haben, ist 10 Tage später das Kapitel fällig zur Abgabe. Das heißt, ich kriege dann nicht 40 Arbeiten auf einmal, sondern ich kriege sie sukzessive. Das betrifft nur die ersten 4 Termine. Beim letzten Termin gibt es dann keine Kapitelaufgaben mehr. Genau. Sonst steht eigentlich alles dabei. Literatur gibt es eigentlich 2 gute Quellen, Krugman Obstfeld und Reinert International Economics. Ich habe Reinert International Economics als Kopie und ich werde dann ein Word-File hochladen, wo Sie einen Link vorfinden und sich das entsprechende Kapitel runterladen können. Nachdem das heikel ist, wird dieser Link nach der heutigen Stunde wieder verschwinden. Also vielleicht könnten Sie sich das dann sichern. Genau. Das heißt, wir haben hier einmal und hier die Beschreibung der Seminararbeit. Ich habe das jeweils nach Kapiteln und nach Terminen, welches Thema wir gerade machen. Ich weiß, es sind weniger Themen als Studierende. Es dürfen pro Thema auch 2 Studierende sein. Es soll aber keine Gruppenarbeit sein, sondern jeder arbeitet für sich. Gibt es mal grundsätzlich zur Organisation noch eine Frage?
Wann sollen wir uns da eintragen? Jetzt gleich oder hat das noch Zeit?
Das ist das Schöne bei Teams. Sie können sich da eintragen. Es ist und zwar jetzt, weil nach
Ja.
dieser heutigen Lehrveranstaltung, also innerhalb der nächsten 3 Stunden, würde ich hier meine Wahl treffen, weil danach lade ich das einfach runter und schmeiße es auf Moodle. Dann müssen Sie eine Sondervereinbarung treffen, dass ich sie danach trage. Also
Okay,
suchen Sie
dann
sich
lieber
was
jetzt.
aus. Dann lieber jetzt. Weise Entscheidung. Genau. Das ist ja das Angenehme bei Teams, dass Sie darauf zugreifen können. Das ist eine echte Schwäche von Moodle, dass man da nichts gemeinsam gleichzeitig bearbeiten kann. Bitte schön.
Das ist jetzt die Einzelarbeit, oder?
Das ist die Einzelarbeit, genau.
Okay, danke.
Also die 30%. Und bei diesen 30% gibt es sozusagen noch einen Fringe Benefit. Erstens ist das dazu gedacht, auch ein bisschen die Last einer schriftlichen Prüfung zu kompensieren. Das heißt, wenn Sie das ordentlich machen, dann können Sie da voll oder nahezu voll punkten. Sie müssen natürlich alle Richtlinien einhalten, insbesondere KI-Nutzung, wobei KI-Nutzung ja nicht grundsätzlich verboten ist. Sie müssen es nur angeben, wofür Sie es verwendet haben. Das würde ich schon erwarten. Und ich würde mir auch erwarten, dass Sie vernünftig zitieren. Weil selbst wenn es eine Kapitelzusammenfassung ist, würde es vielleicht Sinn machen, die eine oder andere Sache zu aktualisieren oder eine andere Sicht der Dinge darzustellen. Das heißt, wenn neben dem Kapitel noch ein oder zwei andere Literaturquellen angegeben werden, dann kommt das ganz sicher sehr gut an. Und wenn Sie sich unsicher sind, ob Sie quasi alle Anforderungen auch wirklich erfüllt haben, können Sie innerhalb dieser Abgabefrist von den 10 Tagen mir Ihre Arbeit auch zur Ansicht schicken, so eine Art Vorcheck, ja, also und kurzes Feedback einholen, ob ich da A, das erfüllt sehe oder B, noch Verbesserungsvorschläge hätte, wenn Sie das möchten. Muss natürlich nicht sein. In dem Fall würde ich Sie aber bitten, dass Sie mir es per Mail schicken. Gibt es sonst noch Fragen? Da fehlt
Können
mir noch was.
sich,
Ja,
können sich pro Thema mehrere eintragen?
ja, also angesichts dessen, wie viele Sie sind, maximal 2, vereinzelt vielleicht auch noch 3. Ja, aber es müssen alle Themen abgedeckt sein.
Und wo finden wir den Link für das Buch, was Sie davor erwähnt haben?
Ja, kleiner Moment.
Achso, okay, danke.
Sie können mir zuschauen, was ich da tue. Written Silverwork, Projects, Project Teams. Ja, die Project Teams machen wir nachher. Und da haben wir den Link. Muss ich erst speichern.
Ich hätte noch eine Frage, damit ich
Gerne.
das ganz verstehe. Es gibt während der Einheit Gruppenarbeiten,
Ja,
die wir auch abgeben müssen oder präsentieren müssen, die aber
ja,
nicht für die Benotung relevant sind, sondern für die Benotung relevant sind, ist die Schlussprüfung und dieses Written Assignment.
genau.
Okay.
So,
Ich hätte auch eine Frage.
gerne.
Und zwar sind es ja mehrere Lehreinheiten. Vielleicht haben Sie das schon erwähnt. Aber sollen wir uns für jede Lerneinheit ein Thema nehmen oder nur ein Thema von einer Lerneinheit?
Nein, nein, Sie können das planen, wann es Ihnen am besten passt, diese Arbeit zu schreiben. Suchen Sie es nach Interesse und nach Termin aus.
Mhm.
Zählt nur ein Kapitel, nicht mehrere Kapitel.
Okay,
Habe ich
verstehe.
das
Das
jetzt
heißt
richtig
aber, wenn ich jetzt,
verstanden?
ich habe jetzt die Lerneinheit 21.02. 4 LE mit der Introduction, oder? Und da habe
Ja,
ich mich eingetragen bei Windows on the World Economy.
ja, genau.
Genau. Und das Thema muss ich jetzt aber nicht, weil ich quasi bei der ersten Lerneinheit das Thema gewählt habe, in 2 Wochen oder sowas, sondern auch am selben Stichtag dann abgeben, oder?
Der Stichtag steht daneben. Due Date ist 3.3.
Aha, okay. Tut mir
Ha,
leid.
extra
Vielen
gelb
Dank.
markiert.
Jetzt sehe ich es gerade, jetzt muss ich sagen.
Ja, so, wo habe ich das jetzt hinkopiert?
Und die Arbeiten, sollen das auf Englisch sein?
Natürlich.
Okay.
So, so. Mhm. Und da finden Sie jetzt die Literatur drinnen. In diesem unscheinbaren Pfeil Literaturdoc. Passwort ist IVWL 26. Dann gebe ich Ihnen noch die Projektteams auch gleich drauf. Dann haben wir alles beieinander, was wir brauchen. Das ist jetzt zum Beispiel für während der Lehrveranstaltung. Und da haben wir unsere einzelnen Termine. Und hier würde ich Sie bitten, sich einzutragen, namentlich mit Ihren Arbeitsteams. Aber ich denke, das ist jetzt nicht so brandeilig. Ich würde sagen, wir starten jetzt einmal mit der entsprechenden Präsentation. Das ist jetzt wieder eine andere, die es nicht sein soll, sondern schließen. Hier haben wir unsere heutige Hauptpräsentation. Das war ja vorher die Frage, wollen Sie das Organisatorische auf Deutsch? Dann machen wir das auf Deutsch. Grundsätzlich die Unterrichtssprache wäre Englisch, das heißt, Sie haben die Präsentationen auf Englisch und Sie haben auch die Prüfung auf Englisch plus eben die Projektarbeiten. Und damit würde ich sagen, mache ich jetzt einen Switch und from now on, I'm going to talk English to you.
Entschuldigung, ich hätte noch eine Frage wegen diesen Projektteams.
Ja.
In welche Reihenfolge muss man sich in der Tabelle eintragen? Weil es tragen sich gerade alles so kreuz und quer und ich kenne mich wirklich nicht mehr aus.
Okay? Dann
Was
noch
jetzt
einmal,
dann nach unten oder nach rechts?
also,
Ich verstehe es ist zuständig XX für. Ich verstehe es nicht so
Okay.
ganz. Ich weiß nicht, ob ich zu blöd bin,
Zuständig?
aber.
today, 21.02.2026. Hier kommt das Thema rein
Okay.
und hier kommen die Namen rein. Und diese Namen braucht man dabei nicht. Okay? Sind auch schon wieder verschwunden. Jetzt soll es klar sein.
Ja,
Kennen Sie
danke.
dich jetzt aus?
Ja, danke.
Okay. So, wir können das da auch ein bisschen breiter machen. Genau. So, switch again to English. Well, international economy is one of my favorites, although in macroeconomics lies my expertise as a labor market expert. That's my profession. I'm a project manager in labor market projects. And as I have said, I am teaching since my own studies. That is a long period of time. And well, international economy is one of the most interesting parts of economics because you can see it each day how important the international relations are for our economic welfare. You've seen our plans and organizational matters, and now I'm going to start with the content. The first part of our lecture is going to deal with the windows on the world economy. That's from the literature source Reinert, International Economy. And I love the perspective the author lies on economy with this windows on the world economy, because he shows us which parts of international economy we are going to focus on. The tasks we going to take up in this book is to discover the nuances of globalization or deglobalization in some kinds of matter. We'll try to explore the world economy and globalization in a balanced manner, and this will help us develop informed views and opinions so that we are capable to take this knowledge with us into our businesses to profit from the knowledge and to understand what's going on around us. And there is a lot going around us. You only have to glance above the Atlantic what the American president now does. We have a period of time where trade liberalization was in the focus of the whole world, and then came Trump. And well, in this literature source, we have the perspective of the windows on the world economy. And we are, first of all, try to imagine a house. Why a house? A house has windows. And you're sitting in this house. This house has 4 windows in which we are looking onto the world. Those windows are the international trade, the international production, international finance, and the international development. Those 4 perspectives we are going to take on the international economy. And last but not least, that's why our course has 5 units of 4. We are going to stay in the house and take a look out of the window. So in our last course, we're going to take the perspective of us as Europeans, as Austrians, and to glance at all those perspectives of international trade, production, finance, and development from a European point of view. Well, let's start with international trade. Let's have a look at this first windows. What does international trade mean? It refers to the exchange of goods and services among the countries of the world, whereas we can distinguish between goods which are tangible and storable, something you can drop on your toe, or services which are intangible and non-storable. Trade in services accounts for approximately 1/4 of global trade, and the amount of trade in services is still increasing. This shows our next slide. First of all, here we have 2 points to focus. The first point are the exports, and the second is the GDP. And what you can see in this long period of time, approximately 30 years, is that international trade plays an increasing role in the world economy. The figure shows us that trade activities grew steadily faster than the GDP. The GDP reflects the production of a country. So if you like to count how this differs, the exports increased in this period of time 6-fold, and the GDP increase was only 2-fold. So international trade relations are the basics of international economy. But not only. The second window shows us this clearly. The second window is the one of international production. This means the production of a product or good in multiple countries. This can take place through contracts or foreign direct investments. Those two types are the main forms of international production. Contracts such as international licensing and franchising have low commitment from the part of the producing company, and you have relatively low control over the production in a foreign country. Foreign direct investment, that refers to multinational enterprises or M&Es, you'll get a little bit more control and more commitment. Firms in another country who own at least 10% of another firm are called a multinational enterprise. So this 10% are the minority share to be a multinational enterprise. Just to give you an example, imagine a book is written in the UK, it's expanded in the United States, printed in Malaysia. So this means there are already 3 countries involved into the production of this book. And the importance of multinational enterprises refers to the following facts, whereas the percentages maybe are not correct. Maybe we can look it up later. Approximately account multinational enterprises for 25% of world's gross domestic product, a quarter. The sales of foreign partners of multinational enterprises exceed the volume of world trade. I think that's also an important point to mention. And multinational enterprises are also involved in approximately 75% of all world trade. That's an interesting point. A multinational enterprise means that the company is bigger. And when we think about the Austrian economy, it's clear we have a lot of small and medium enterprises. So for Austrian companies, it's not so easy to take part in international production, and trade is another point of view, but international production needs help from the Austrian perspective. Another interesting percentage is approximately that 1/3 of the world trade takes place within M&Es, and they account for approximately 75% of the civilian research and development. Big companies can easier achieve the money to invest in research and development. Those facts are only different approaches to measure the importance of multinational enterprises. Another form of measuring is to have a look at the nominal foreign direct investment inflows. And it's quite interesting to see in which countries these foreign direct investment inflows go or have gone over the time. We can also see approximately the last 25 years, and we have low-income countries. They cannot be even seen on this graph, then the middle-income countries and the high-income countries. And what we can state is that the most investments took place in high-income countries, and the meaning of the investments in middle-income countries is increasing, but not that high than in high-income countries. So the industrialized nations invest into itself, but not in low-income countries. What we can see is here the impacts of the financial crisis. Here, a downgrade in the year 2008, 2009. It also had an impact on the middle-income countries, but this is a remarkable break in the nominal FDI inflows. So in times of crisis, investments decreased. The next window we are going to take a look at is the one of international finance. And international finance also plays an increasing role in the world economy. It's defined as the exchange of assets among countries, and individuals and firms all around the world conduct international transactions in different forms or different types of assets. And such different types are, for example, currencies, equities and shares, government bonds or corporate bonds, and real estate. We have the examples, but what is an asset? Just to give you a definition of the term asset, these are financial objects that have a monetary value which can change over a time. And the changing value is also plays an important role, and as we think of the aspects of speculation, something like that. In general, the international finance relations play an increasingly important role in the world economy. And this is shown in this figure that shows us the daily foreign exchange market turnover and the exports. This is the value of all transactions performed in the foreign exchange market. Looking at this figure, the bars show the financial turnovers, the blue bars, and the line shows the development of exports of goods and services. And what we can see is since 2001, the importance of financial transactions or turnovers grew and then reaches the exports and nowadays exceeds them. So this just shows us the importance of the financial window. Last but not least, at the last glance of our window is the window of international development. And it is hoped that the processes of international trade, production, and finance will contribute to improved levels of welfare and try to embed the standards of living of the people throughout the world. But there are two major issues we have to take into account, or two basic ideas I want to show you. How can we measure the levels of value, of welfare and the standards of living? So the measurement of welfare is a problem, and how can we achieve more welfare? And that's the point we are talking about in international development. There are measurements of the living standards, such as the Human Development Index, that's internationally standardized and measures the per capita income, the average life expectancy, and the average levels of education. These parts are, or these basic parts are, first of all, per capita income measures the monetary welfare, and the both others, the average life expectancy and the average levels of education, refer to social welfare. Just to have a look, a glance at the standards, 2017, we can then have a look at the actual data. Here we have different countries with the GDP per capita, the life expectancy, and the mean years of schooling, and the Human Development Index. And how is it to interpret? The Human Development Index starts at 0 and ends with 1. So 0 is low and 1 is the best. Just to show you, in Ethiopia, the GDP per capita in US dollar is very low. Life expectancy is also low. The mean years of schooling are the lowest in this column, and the resulting Human Development Index shows us 0.46, a very low level of the Human Development Index. The United States, for example, on the other hand, high GDP per capita, high life expectancy. Interesting is that in South Korea and even Costa Rica, the life expectancy is higher. Maybe this refers to the Big Macs the Americans are eating. Mean years of schooling is also very high, and this means that the Human Development Index in the United States is 0.92, a high level. So there are possibilities to measure the living standards, but we are going to talk about strategies to better the living standards and how we can achieve the goals to help the people in poorer countries. The perspective of the windows was, first of all, the window of international trade, then international production, then international finance, and last but not least, international development. What we have to do now, after here having talked about the 4 previous windows, we have to connect them, because each of these windows offers a view, but each has also a frame. Each offers some insight, as very specific insight to the world economy, but it needs to be connected with each other, because between these 4 windows exist relations. They're interrelated deeply, and just to show you with an example, the financial crisis, which took place in the year 2009, was a financial crisis. So the first point of view was international finance. It started in the financial window, but it had also strong effects on the others, on international production and international trade. So this perspective of the 4 windows is just to open your mind to the different kinds of aspects international economy brings with it. Now we are going to start with the basics of international trade. And the literature source, the book of Reinhardt, always starts with referring to the analytical elements in a specific chapter. And in this chapter, we are going to use the following analytical elements to our journey through the world of trade. First of all, countries or states. That's the primary focus. Then we have also sectors. We have to detect this means different categories of production, final goals, or the primary sector, or anything like that. Tasks, for example, means that we take a look at the things that have to be done. What should you do to reach a specific goal? The analytical element of firms or company means that we are analyzing the production units because companies and firms are the ones who decide where to put the money and not the states directly. Factors of production, such as labor and capital, are influenced by the decisions of firms and states. Currencies also play an important role in international relations. And last but not least, the financial assets also are important with the values, shares, and so on, and the amount of money they are binding. To investigate special aspects of trade, and that's our today's topic. We're not finished with the topic of trade. We're going to talk about it next Saturday, also in a more practical point of view. This part is a kind of revision of what you have heard in winter semester. I hope so. And we talked about, we are going to talk about the basics of trade. So that's hardcore economy. And we try to detect why trade relations develop. And for that, we are looking at the chapter Absolute Advantage. I think you had Dr. Fritz in winter semester. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
It
Did you
was the
hear
third
it?
semester, so a year ago.
Oh, well, then maybe a revision would be a good idea. Yeah. Have you ever heard of the principle of absolute advantage?
Yes, at Dr. Fritz lecture.
Okay. Well, it is one of the basics of trade, and so it is in your third semester. So I hope you know a little bit, but I hope you're not fully informed so that I can cancel the chapter, because I needed to tell you the whole story of the trade relations. The analytical elements in this chapter are the countries and how they trade with each other, the different sectors of production, and also the factors of production, capital, and labor. The main question we are analyzing in this part is, why does a country export or import a particular good? And just to introduce, we are using a simple supply and demand diagram to answer the following particular questions. A simple demand diagram, supply and demand diagram, is shown on the next slide, but firstly I want you to tell you the questions. We want to know why a country does export a particular good, why does it import a particular good, and what forces are behind expansion of world trade. that is occurring in the world economy. The absolute advantage, the basic of this chapter, means that there is a possibility that due to the differences in supply conditions, one country can produce a product at a lower price than another country. Well, that's quite clear. Supply conditions are the basis of production. The production cost influence the supply of the producers. And this means that more endowments, either in labor force or land or technology, refers to another supply curve. So let's have a look at the supply and demand curve, just to explain a little bit. We have here as an example the domestic rice market, and you can see here the supply curve and here the demand curve with all the relations you have learned in the 3rd semester. The supply curve is upward sloping. This means the producers supply more of a good the higher the price is, and the demand curve is downward sloping. This means the consumers demand more of a good the cheaper it is. And in the middle, the intersection of those curves shows us the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity in this market. I think that's quite enough to have a small review on the secrets of demand and supply. Well, for the rice market, why do we choose the rice market? Because it is always internationally traded and therefore a very good example. Throughout the world, rice is exchanged in markets. We have here the description of the supply curve that's upward sloping. More quantity is supplied if prices increase. Then we have to distinguish between two interesting facts. If the price changes, point 1. This is represented in the diagram by movements along, up and down the supply curve. And the result is that the quantity changes. And there are two other facts, which are known as changes in supply, that shift the curve itself. For example, reductions in the input prices. The input prices are the costs of labor or the costs of the seeds or the cost for the gasoline for the machines to produce rice. Reduction in input prices and other improvements in technology shift the supply curve to the right. This means that at a given price, the producers are able to produce more of this good. And on the other hand, increases in input prices or a backslash in technology that shift the supply curve to the left, upwards, and this means that the costs have increased and the producers are not able to produce the quantity they had before. So the quantity decreases. So 2 points. First of all, changes in prices take place on the curve, and changes of the supply curve shift the supply curve itself. And it's the same with the demand curve. the demand curve is downward sloping, consumers will only buy more of a good if the price decreases, and the changes in price are represented by movements along the demand curve and result in changes of the quantity demanded. And similar to the changes of the supply curve that were followed by a shift of the supply curve, there are also additional demand side factors that influence the demand curve, such as there are mentioned incomes and preferences. Incomes, because if the consumer have more money, they are able to buy more goods. And preferences, if a good is more trendy or the marketing's very well, the consumers like to buy it more. And this will be reflected in a shift of the demand curve to the outside, whereas negative impacts on the demand curve lead to a shift to the inside with the consequences on price and quantity. And that's also, I forgot to mention, an important point of view. If the price changes, only the quantity changes as a result. And if something else happens, something additional factors happen, the price and the quantity change because of that. So what lies in between is the equilibrium. The intersection of supply and demand curve determines the equilibrium in this domestic rice market. The shifts will change price and quantity. And as we have stated, rice markets are international. And this means that we cannot analyze them effectively only using simple supply and demand curves. What we need, or what we have to discuss on this problem with the concept of absolute advantage. And we state that rice is produced in two countries, Vietnam and Japan. What we can assume is that the demand conditions are exactly the same in both countries. Why is this realistic? Yes, it is, because it's basic food. Yeah, and either Vietnam and Japan cook Asiatically, so the amount the consumers demand rice would be approximately the same. So it's okay if we say that the demand conditions are exactly the same. This means that the demand curves in those countries look like each other. And referring to the absolute advantage means that trade often arises due to the difference of supply conditions. I mentioned it by introducing this chapter, and we can show it with a supply curve, a different supply curve, that Vietnam's supply curve is farther to the right than the supply curve of Japan, because Vietnam can supply more rice than Japan. I don't think, as it's said here on the slides, that Vietnam uses superior technology, but I think the production inputs are lower in Vietnam and also the land endowments. So first of all, let's have a look at the demand curve for rice in Vietnam and Japan. And you see the demand curve is exactly the same. Now we add the supply curves. And as you can see, the supply curve of Vietnam lies further to the right, and the supply curve of Japan lies further to the left. This means that the autarky prices, autarky price means the local price in the country of Vietnam and Japan, in Vietnam is lower than the autarky price of Japan. And, well, what about the autarky prices? We have, first of all, the situation that there is no trade involved between Vietnam and Japan. And so these two prices are known as the autarky prices. Autarky refers to a situation where a country doesn't have trade relations. Not really realistic, but for our technical analysis, we are going to focus on this situation first. This means, just to have a look at the two autarky prices, that Vietnam is the cheaper producer. And in this case, Vietnam has an absolute advantage in the production of rice vis-a-vis Japan. So, what's the situation when those countries start to trade? Oops. The absolute advantage implies a potential pattern of trade, the possibility to gain or to win from trade relations. And if the two countries start to trade and forego autarky, the world price will lie between the Vietnamese price and the Japanese price. This situation, or the consequences of this situation, we can see here. The position of the world price is here between the Japanese and the Vietnamese price. And what we can see is that in the different countries, we now have a different situation. This will lead to the situation that Vietnam is going to export parts of their production, and Japan will stop producing rice and importing it from Vietnam. Why? Because the world price is interesting for the Vietnamese suppliers. They start to supply more rice, and the excess demand can be exported. And in Japan, the situation is that the lower world market price leads to lower supply in Japan, and this lower supply in Japan is imported by the Vietnamese rice exports. So we have the situation that the world market price leads to trade relations in this case. And what we can here see in this schematic view is the principles of absolute advantage. And what we can see is that superior technology or larger endowments of factors lead to an absolute advantage in a sector. In this case, it's the Vietnamese rice producers with the absolute advantage. And within that superior technology and so on, this supply condition lies the tendency to export this sector's product. On the other hand, inferior technology, smaller endowments, and higher costs lead to an absolute disadvantage in the sector and a tendency to import the sector's products. This would reflect to the situation of the Japanese rice producers. This leads to a question, and I'm going to give you the answer. What ensures that the amount exported by Vietnam is the same as the amount imported by Japan? I tried to explain it with excess demand or shortage with the figures, but here we have it explained in a written form, where if the exports of Vietnam are smaller than the imports of Japan, we would have an excess demand or a shortage in the world markets. And excess demand leads to a rise of prices. And if the world market of price of rice rose, the exports of Vietnam would expand because a higher world market price is attractive to the suppliers, the producers in Vietnam, and the imports of Japan would contract until this excess demand in the world market disappears. So, what is the force behind that ensures that the amount exported by Vietnam is the same as the amount imported by Japan? The answer is the market forces. The market forces of demand and supply. What happens with the prices if we have a demand, an excess demand or a shortage? So, to summarize so far this example, we have seen that the differences in supply conditions among the countries rise to complementary patterns of absolute advantage, and these patterns of the absolute advantage make it possible the complementary patterns of international trade. So, absolute advantage leads to international trade directly. We can also ask, what are the gains from trade? What's to win for suppliers or consumers in a country? And given a pattern of absolute advantage, it's possible for a country to give up autarky in favor of importing or exporting. So Japan can import rice and Vietnam can export rice, but what are the forces to do so? Giving up autarky and start to trade is maybe a decision that's traditionally a problem, for example, for Japan, as a traditional oriented culture. This has been a problem, but we can explain it with the consumer and producer surplus, who really gains from the trade relations. Consumer and producer surplus is one another basic concept of the economy, and the consumer surplus is the amount of money the consumer wins from the market relations, and the producer surplus is what the producer gains from the market system. Just to give you a small revision, the consumer surplus lies below the demand curve, and the producer surplus lies above the supply curve here. And well, what we can see here in this figure 2.6, what are the gains from trade? if export and import relations exist. We have different areas, A, B, C, D, and we're going to analyze it. A and B is that what the producers of rice in Vietnam gain from the trade relations. But there is also a loss of the consumers because they have to pay a higher price than before, and they lose part of their consumer surplus. On the other hand, in Japan, the situation is that part of the Japanese suppliers or rice producers lose parts of their surpluses, but the winner in this case are the Japanese consumers who gain more rice at a lower price. So the consumer surplus in Japan increases. Well, to analyze in detail, we can see that when Vietnam moved from autarky to exporting in the rice market, it's quite clear that the producer experienced an increase in price and also an increase in quantity. And that's a situation the producers, the suppliers like, because more price and more quantity means more better chance to win. So this situation is very good for the producers. It's not so good for the consumers who have to pay a higher price for their rice than before. The consumers experience an increase in price and a decrease in quantity and have to pay more than before. Well, to analyze in detail, the producers gain area B and C, and the consumers lose area A. You can look it up in the figure if you want to, but it's quite clear that the gain of the producers exceed the area that reflects the loss of the consumers. So the welfare in Vietnam increases. Vietnam gains from its entry to the world economy. What about Japan? In Japan, when it moves from autarky to importing in the rice market, the producers, the Japanese producer, experience a decrease of price because the world market price lies below the autarky price of Japan. And they also experience a decrease in quantity. So the situation in the world market is not so good for the Japanese rice producers. They are harmed, but the consumers in Japan get more because they experience a decrease in price and an increase in quantity. So their consumer surplus consists of the areas C and D. And to finally analyze the Japanese situation, the consumers gain more than the producers lose. And it's the same situation than before. There is a positive net welfare for the Japanese as a consequence of entering the world market as an importer. So both countries win in this situation. Whoops. So moving from autarky to importing or exporting shows a net increase for the countries involved, and that's called the so-called gains from trade. if we talk about the opinions in literature and so on, there are also opinions that state that trade relationships are a win-lose proposition for the countries involved. But the basic idea of the gains from trade is that trade can, or better could, be mutually beneficial to both countries involved, either Japan and Vietnam. But this concept has also its limitations. What are these limitations? Trade can or could improve overall welfare for the countries involved, but there are also countries that, or that the possibility exists that a country does not have an absolute advantage in anything. So this would mean that it cannot take place or cannot take part in international trade. But this situation is unlikely to be true because there is another concept, the concept of comparative advantage, that shows that even if you have no absolute advantage in anything, you can always profit from trading. But there are also other limitations, and these other limitations are that a country as a whole mutually gain from trade, but this does not mean that anybody in this country profits. Because as we have seen, the producers in Japan do not profit from trading with Vietnam or on the world market. And also the consumers in Vietnam do not profit. But the country as a whole can have a positive net welfare. And it's also not said that the distribution of this net welfare of a country is distributed correctly between the people in this country. What I mean is the so-called Verteilungsgerechtigkeit. Well, let me see how late it is. So. Ich würde für eine Pause optieren. 10 minutes?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So let's start again with the following chapter. Just a glance if my microphone's on. Yes, it is. So now we talk about the third chapter, the comparative advantage. And in the following fields of analysis, we're talking about the countries involved, the sectors involved, and the factors of production. And the factors of production in this case are capital and labor. And the sectors we're talking about is agriculture and industry. The previous chapter deals with the agricultural sector only, the rice market. And now we are going to talk about trade relations between Vietnam and Japan in two different sectors. First of all, we have to make a little review of the PPFs, the production possibility frontiers. I think you know a little bit about production possibility frontiers. Is that right? Is that right?
Could you repeat the question
I
one more
think we
time,
have
please?
learned. I think we've heard of it, but I
Yeah.
don't know if we all remember so good.
I asked if you know the concept or remember the concept of production possibility frontiers.
I know we had to draw it for the exam.
Well, then you're experts. But nevertheless, I'm going to make a small review of the PPFs. And just to explain, PPFs depict the combinations of the output of two goods. In this case, we are talking about rice and motorcycles in the economies of Vietnam or Japan. Two countries, two goods. They are produced with the given resources in the specific country and technology. And just to have a glance how a PPF looks like, we have right-hand side the quantity of motorcycles and below the quantity of rice. And the production possibility frontier gives us the frontier, what can be produced with given resources at different points. So point A and B reflects the full employment on a PPF because the points lie on the PPF. Point C is not possible to produce because it's over the given resources. And point D means that the country produces inefficiently. It's feasible to produce, but it leaves resources unemployed. And well, that's the concept to explain the comparative advantage. And well, the reason why this comparative advantage is important is that it is able to explain a part of the world trade of today. The part of the world trade that takes place with undeveloped and developed or industrialized countries is based on the principle of comparative advantage still in these years. But let's explain it from the beginning. As the income increased in Vietnam, the consumers began to think about a motorcycle. So the preferences to buy motorcycles exist, and therefore we place motorcycles alongside to the rice, so we can understand this concept of comparative advantage and its generating role of trade relations. Consider again Vietnam and Japan. And first of all, both countries produce two goods, rice and motorcycles. And we assume that the demand for rice and motorcycles in Vietnam and Japan is just the same in fixed proportions. That's shown in this figure. The double demand for rice and motorcycles in Japan is the same. So the difference lies in the PPF, in the production possibility frontier. And therefore we take the next step to explain it. The resource or technology conditions in Vietnam lead to a production possibility frontier that's biased towards rice. And the technology conditions in Japan lead to a production possibility frontier that's biased towards motorcycles. So the difference in supply conditions influence the position of the production possibility frontier. Vietnam has or might have superior technology in rice production. I think it's the land endowments, but Japan definitely has superior technology in producing motorcycles. And Vietnam might be better endowed in rice production factors, and Japan might be better endowed in motorcycle production factors. So that's the consequences. The demand side's nearly the same in both countries, but the production possibility frontier looks different. So what are the consequences? Furthermore, to analyze just a little bit, the production possibility frontier in a system of freely operating markets and full employment of production factors is reflected by their opportunity costs. The price of rice divided through the price of motorcycles. That's the so-called relative prices. And where do we find those relative prices? We find the relative prices on the next slide as a tangent on the production possibility frontier. And what we can see is that the tangency line giving the relative prices is flatter in Vietnam than in Japan, because the opportunity cost of rice is lower in Vietnam than in Japan. And in other words, under autarky, or the relative price of rice is lower in Vietnam. Oh, there's a mistake. But I think you get the meaning by looking at the figure. So the opportunity costs of rice producing is definitely lower in Vietnam than in Japan. What we can see is an expression of the pattern of comparative advantage. The differences in economy-wide supply conditions cause these differences in relative autarky prices, and hence also a pattern of comparative advantage. What we can see, or what we have to state, is that the comparative advantage involves 4 prices rather than 2 prices as in absolute advantage. And it's stated that a country can have a comparative advantage in a good in which it has an absolute disadvantage. And that's the case we have to mention. The consequences for international trade will be that if Vietnam and Japan abandon the autarky in favor of trade, the world relative price of rice will lie somewhere between the two autarky price ratios. That's quite clear, and the situation is nearly the same as in autarky, but it's different from the concept of absolute advantage. So let's have a look at the figure. We have the situation here, the relative price first, and the broken line shows us the consequences. If they start to trade, the results will be that point A and point B is not available anymore, but point C shows us the consumption at the world price. This means that by trading, the Vietnamese people can consume more rice and more motorcycles at a higher price, and the Japanese also. We have also here the areas of consumer and producer surplus mentioned. From A to B, we see the increased production of rice, and the tangent line that is reflected in the broken line via point C gets steeper. And in the situation of Japan is the following: the increased production of motorcycles from A to B shows that the tangent line gets flatter. What are the consequences and what are the things to be discussed in this situation? These lines shown by the comparative advantage are steeper than the autarky price lines in Vietnam and flatter than the autarky price line in Japan. The tangencies of these world price lines with the PPFs determine the new production points in Vietnam and Japan. And in Vietnam, The movement along the PPF from A to B involves an increase in production of rice, while in Japan, this movement involves an increase in production of motorcycles. Because Vietnam has the comparative advantage via Japan in rice production, and Japan has the comparative advantage in the production of motorcycles in comparison to Vietnam. So the main point of view to mention is that moving from autarky into international trade relations starts to restructure the economy's production towards the good in which the country has a comparative advantage. Shortly said, the Japanese will produce more motorcycles and the Vietnamese will produce more rice. The consumption points, C, for Vietnam and Japan must be along the diagonal demand lines and occur where the broken lines, the dashed world price lines, intersect the demand lines. Both consumption and production must respect the world prices, and both B and C must be on the world price line. The next figure shows us the consequences for trade, and these trade relations we can see is here on the side, the import of motorcycles to Vietnam and export of rice to Japan, and on the other hand, the import of rice to Japan and the export of motorcycles. So the Japanese people export, or producers export the motorcycles and import the rice, and the Vietnamese import the motorcycles and export the rice. And both are happy with this situation. Just to discuss or summarize, in Vietnam, the production of rice exceeds the consumption. The difference is exported. The production of motorcycles falls short of consumption, and the shortfall of the production in Vietnam is imported from Japan. And in Japan, on the other hand, the production of motorcycles exceeds the consumption. In this country, the difference is exported, whereas the production of rice falls short of production and the shortfall is imported. And as a pattern of comparative advantage, this gives rise to a complementary pattern of trade and a restructuring of the trade or production structure in the different countries, in the two countries in this case. Just to mention, to international trade in general, the concept of absolute advantage can leave the impression that a country could lack an advantage in anything and therefore have nothing to export. That's not quite true. An absolute disadvantage in a specific product does not preclude having a comparative advantage in that product. Vietnam, for example, could have an absolute disadvantage in rice, but still export rice because it's, in comparison to another country, the cheaper producer. So the comparative advantage is the more powerful concept than the absolute advantage, and it is perhaps the most central concept in international economics. But as I have said at the beginning of this chapter, only between the countries with different endowments or a different state of development. To resume the gains from trade, we can ask the questions if a country should actually give up autarky in favor of importing and exporting. And the next figure shows that the movement, or was it the previous figure? The number of figures is interesting. It was the previous figure, shows us that we have learned that the movement from autarky to trade, the points A to C, increases the consumption of both rice and motorcycles. So we have a gain in net welfare. And that's the most important point to mention. Both countries win. Well, but there are also gains from trade caveats. This means Vorbehalte or problems. Gains from trade occur for the country as a whole, as a state, and that's also a point why we focus our analysis on different types of analyzing factors, such as states. A state as a whole, a country as a whole, can have gains from trade, but it does not mean that every person or individual or group within a country will benefit from trade relations. There are good reasons to expect that there are also groups losing from increased trade relations. And as we have seen, the Japanese producer of rice will lose and the Vietnamese consumers will lose. If the country as a whole profits, depends on the relations between supply and demand in the specific country. Because there are not only winners, but also losers, the losing groups will also oppose increased trade relations despite overall gains to their country. And sometimes alleged international trade is almost always detrimental to the environment. Detrimental, it could be kind of an enemy to sustainable development. It could, but it mustn't, it needn't be. However, the situation is not ever this clearly. The theoretical and empirical results demonstrate that increased trade can be either good or bad for the environment, and we need to approach the trade and environment issue separately and on a case-by-case basis. It could be both positive or a negative influence on the environment. Also, there are some goods that are traded do not contribute to increased welfare, and from the kind of character of the goods, such as rockets or landmines or other or drugs or anything like that. So we can not say in general that every trade relation is increases the welfare of a nation. Well, the next step is, and I think this is the last part for today, is the chapter 4. We're looking at intra-industry trade, and we use the US cheese market to explain this intra-industry trade. Our systematical approach in this case is we are looking at countries. In this case, it's just one country. But first of all, we are looking at one specific sector. And then we are talking about tasks a company has to do and the consequences for firms and sectors. Before we start, we have first of all to differentiate between types of trade that exist. What we have been shown in chapter 2 and 3, Vietnam and Japan, the rice or motorcycle case is inter-industry trade. And the phrase to describe the situation is we can produce either rice or motorcycles. And this means this leads to either imports or exports in a given sector of the economy. And the source is the comparative advantage. Then we can distinguish between horizontal intra-industry and vertical intra-industry. And the different phrases are both and the same. And this means that both imports and exports in a given sector of the economy at the same stage of processing. And the basis or source is product differentiation. And vertical intra-industry is described by both imports and exports in a given sector of the economy at different stages of processing. And the source or description is fragmentation, sometimes comparative advantage. And well, what can we say about these types of trade and how can we explain them? We take a look at the next figure that shows us the evolution of intra-industry trade at the 5 and 3-digit SITC levels. Well, what the hell? It's that. SITC is the Standard International Trade Classification. And the different levels, 5 and 3, gives us the hint how deep it is classified. For example, in the Austrian economy, we have the so-called NACE classification. Have you ever heard of NACE classification?
Nope.
No.
No.
That's the international classification for economic activities. It comes from the United Nations. It's the basis for the Austrian Volkswirtschaftlichen Gesamtrechnung. It's the basic for all statistics, and it gives us the different classifications for products and goods. Maybe you can Google it in the meantime, NACE classification. Well, what we can see is the evolution of intra-industry trade, the trade within an industry, and it has grown over the years. What are therefore the global patterns of intra-industry trade? Approximately 1/3 of the world trade takes place as intra-industry trade within a sector. Especially prominent is it in manufactured goods among the developed or high-income countries of the world, and it probably accounts up to 70% of trade. And globally, intra-industry trade is becoming more important over time, particularly in Asia. The global patterns of intra-industry trade can be mentioned as the increasing extent of the intra-industry trade in the world trading system has implications for the adjustment of economies to increasing trade. Increasing in inter-industry trade based on absolute or comparative advantage involve import sector contracting and export sector expanding. This requires that reproductive resources, most notably workers, shift from the contracting to the expanding sectors in order to avoid unemployment. That's a huge problem. And it's also not an easy process. It often gives rise to calls for protection. And the next step is to have a look at this adjustment process in intra-industry trade, because this process is very different. In a given sector, experiences increases in imports and exports simultaneously. Workers are less likely to need to shift between the sectors, and the demands for protection from increased imports are less likely. We call it the so-called smooth adjustment hypothesis. Just concerning the smoothness. In inter-industry trade, it is low and it not at all smooth. In vertical intra-industry trade, it's medium, and in horizontal intra-industry trade, it's high. This problem of the workers is reflected or reflects the problem of where people lose their job. They lose it in inter-industry trade between different sectors. So, for example, a company decides to produce in another country where the labor force is cheaper than in their home country. So there is no smoothness. The people lose their job. In vertical intra-industry trade, it's different because there are different stages of production, and the problem of the workers is easier to handle. And in horizontal intra-industry trade, the problem is has the smallest amount because they can change the company because they are on the same level. The following example shows an explanation of intra-industry trade on a horizontal basis, and we are developing this explanation by the use of the US trade in cheese. We have to allow for product differentiation among types of cheese, and the two types of cheese we are using is blue cheese, denoted by B, and food service cheese, which lies on pizzas, is called F. And the next figure shows us the situation and the trade implications of these supply and demand relationships. So let's have a look at the supply and demand curve for blue and food service cheese. Left-hand side, we have the blue cheese. Right-hand side, we have the food service cheese. The supply conditions for blue cheese are more different than the supply conditions for food service cheese. This means this economy can produce a lower amount of blue cheese and a higher amount of food service cheese. The consumer the demand curve is the same for both products. And what does this mean for the US intra-industry trade in cheese? By or according to a given world price. The world price in this case is given and cannot be influenced. What are the consequences within one sector? The US export food service cheese because they're a cheap producer of food service cheese, and they start to import blue cheese. It's the same sector, and what's shown in this figure is that even it's the same sector, one country can either be an importer or an exporter of a product, depending on the world price, in this case for blue cheese and food service cheese. So the gains from intra-industry trade for the company and for the country in this case, does intra-industry trade in cheese benefit the United States, or is it unnecessary and wasteful? Well, we, as before, take consumer and producer surplus into account to analyze this fact. The US profit from intra-industry trade because the consumer surplus A and B is bigger than A alone. The A will be the loss of the producers in this case. And to conclude, the situation on the food service side, the producer surplus, C and D, is bigger than C, that's the loss of the consumer surplus. So the total gain for the US market is B and D, and the United States profit from entering intra-industry trade. So let's have a look at the time. Okay. Ich würde gerne jetzt einfach, um einmal ins Tun zu kommen, mit den Projekten beginnen. Und weil sonst wird es zu hektisch und wir werden dann nicht fertig mit den Präsentationen. Und ich denke, dass es für heute mal fürs Erste genug ist, wenn wir manche Dinge nicht fertig machen. Also zum Beispiel die letzten Slides, die hier noch offen geblieben sind, dann wird das abgedeckt durch die durch ihre 30%, durch ihre Kapitelzusammenfassungen, wird dann aber auch bei der Prüfung nicht prioritär abgefragt. Aber wir werden insgesamt zu einem Gesamtüberblick kommen. Das hat Ihnen ja ein bisschen Gedanken gemacht, wie funktioniert das mit diesen Projektarbeiten. Ich werde jetzt einmal die Themen online stellen, die ich vorbereitet habe. So, wo können wir hin? Da. Und das ist eigentlich recht einfach für heute zum Aufwärmen. Erstes Thema, erklären Sie die 4 Windows, vielleicht mit einem etwas anderen Ansatz, als Sie es in den Folien gesehen haben. Zweiter Ansatz, erklären Sie Absolute Advantage. Dritte Frage, Comparative Advantage. Vierter Punkt, was ist Intra-Industry Trade? Da fehlt ein R. Und so wird es dann eher weitergehen. Also diese ersten Fragen von 1 bis 4 ist jetzt wirklich zum Aufwärmen eine kleine Wiederholung, dass Sie mal ins Tun hineinkommen. 5 und 6 ist tatsächlich eine Research-Aufgabe. Finden Sie Beispiele für Inter-Industry Trade? Schauen Sie sich nochmal die Definition an und finden Sie ein Beispiel für Intra-Industry Trade und suchen Sie sich ein Beispiel aus der Realität, also eine Firma, die involviert ist in Inter-Industry Trade oder Intra-Industry Trade. Und stellen Sie uns diese kurz vor und zeigen Sie, welche Auswirkungen das hat. Der nächste Punkt ist, wir werden wahrscheinlich keine 10 Minuten Präsentation, sondern 5 Minuten Präsentation pro Thema haben. Nur um das ein bisschen zu beschreiben, Sie brauchen nicht alle präsentieren. Das ist etwas, was ich immer wieder feststelle, dass dann die ganze Gruppe der Reihe nach aufmarschiert. Sie können sich aussuchen, wer präsentiert. Sie können sich auch abwechseln, ja, wenn Sie möchten. Und ja, damit würde ich jetzt einfach beginnen. Sie haben die Themen da drinnen. Wie sollen Sie es bearbeiten? Sie können in Ihren Teams diesen Teamkanal betreten und sich dort in einer eigenen Sitzung besprechen. Haben Sie das schon mal gemacht?
Ja,
Okay, sehr gut.
und im
Äh,
Dokument, was Sie vorher offen hatten, gibt es 6 Punkte und jedes Team muss eines davon zugehörig der Gruppennummer bearbeiten oder müssen wir alle Punkte bearbeiten?
nein, das war das, was noch fehlt, nämlich die Zuordnung zu den Fragen. Ja, und damit klärt sich jetzt auch, wieso da steht zuständig für. Und da gibt es jetzt mehrere Möglichkeiten. Sie können sich's aussuchen, nach dem Prinzip First Come, First Serve, oder ich muss es zuteilen, wenn das nicht funktioniert.
Aber es geht um die Themen, um die 6 Themen, die Sie gerade
Es geht um
vorgestellt
die
haben.
6 Themen. Es ist
Okay.
jeweils immer nur eines dieser 6 Themen zu bearbeiten, natürlich.
Verstehen.
Da
Okay.
nicht alle 6. Sitzen wir morgen noch da.
Gut, dann würde ich gleich den Anfang machen. Ich würde gern Absolute Advantage machen für meine Gruppe,
Ja,
falls die
Sie
anderen
sind
nicht
daher,
einverstanden sind. Cortez, Gruppe
wo
5.
finde ich es? Gruppe 5. Ups. Gut, das ist jetzt Thema Nummer 2.
Genau.
Das heißt, wir können uns aussuchen, an welchem Datum wir präsentieren möchten. Habe ich das jetzt richtig verstanden?
Nein,
An welchen Thema wir nehmen.
Sie können sich das Thema jetzt aussuchen, und zwar
Ach so.
jetzt, nicht.
Mhm.
Das heißt, die Gruppe mit dem Herrn Cortez macht Absolute Advantage. Die 4 Windows sind schon bei der Gruppe 4. Die Gruppe 1, 2, 3 und 6 muss ich noch
Ja,
entscheiden.
2. Wir nehmen Comparative Advantage.
Advantage.
Ja, Sie können aber selber reinschreiben. Da muss ja nicht ich tippen, oder?
Ja.
Können wir auch machen.
So, Moment.
Ja, jetzt ist schon reingeschrieben worden.
Na, passt. Sehr gut. Fehlt noch die Gruppe 6. Aha, Intra-Industry Trade haben wir. Ja, das wäre die Frage Nummer 4. Und dann haben wir noch die Praxisbeispiele. Genau. Das heißt, die Gruppe 3 hat sich entschieden für Inter-Industry Trade. Gemäß dem Ausschlussverfahren haben wir die Gruppe 6 mit Intra-Industry Trade. Ein konkretes Beispiel finden. Ja? Weiß jeder, was er zu tun hat und wo sich die Gruppe trifft?
Ja, danke.
Wir müssen eine PowerPoint vorbereiten oder
Nein,
reicht
müssen Sie
ein-
nicht.
Okay.
Wissen Sie, was das Schlaueste ist im Online-Setting? Das mache
Ein
ich
Handout,
überall
oder?
so. Ja, und dann das Handout in die Angabe hineinkopieren.
Mhm.
Das heißt, Sie haben ja das Dokument mit der Aufgabenstellung, Projects, Nummer 1. Und wenn Sie es da hineinkopieren, Ihr Handout, nachdem Sie es fertiggestellt haben, können wir es bei der Präsentation einfach durchrollen lassen und müssen nicht 27 Mal umsteigen und neu teilen.
Ja.
Und wir haben dann zum Schluss ein Dokument, wo alles drinnen ist. Das würde ich eindeutig bevorzugen. Oder? Ist doch eine schlaue Idee.
Ja.
Ja, was gut.
Ich gebe Ihnen jetzt in der Gruppe ungefähr 5 Minuten zum Überlegen und dann gehe ich Sie besuchen. Das Tolle an den Teams ist, dass ich da einfach einsteigen kann und werde Sie fragen, wie Sie zurechtkommen und ob Sie da irgendwelche Inputs von mir brauchen. Ja?
Ganz kurz,
Ansonsten,
Frau Richter, ich habe nach meinem Namen gesucht, aber diese nicht finden können.
na, dann müssen
Kann
Sie
Sie
ihn wo
mich,
dazu schreiben.
also ich muss es irgendwo dazu schreiben, oder?
Ja,
Okay. Ich dachte irgendwie, die Liste wäre schon fertig, ich habe das nicht ganz gecheckt. Irgendwie ist es ein
dann
bisschen
sind Sie
kompliziert.
wahrscheinlich erst etwas später aufgeschlagen in dieser Lehrveranstaltung.
Wir haben uns alle
Eigentlich bin ich von
eingetragen.
Anfang an dabei, aber irgendwie ist es heute komplizierter für mich. Aber
Okay?
danke, werde ich eintragen, danke.
Na, suchen Sie sich eine Gruppe und schreiben Sie sich dazu und dort arbeiten Sie mit. Ja?
Wir können schon wechseln in die Gruppen, oder?
Sie können schon wechseln. Ich schreibe in den Chat hinein, also Arbeitszeit bis 16:45 Uhr inklusive einer Pause, die Sie vielleicht noch gerne machen wollen. Die dürfen Sie individuell machen.